Everyone can see that? More or less. All right. Let's see if we can. Well, I know there's not a lot. Mostly I just talk. So, I wanted to start off by saying I'm tired. Now, it would probably be understandable because I flew here on Tuesday and I haven't actually slept that much, and jet lag's starting to kick in. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about. What I really wanted to talk about is something that we all kind of feel. And what it really is that I'm tired of failing our clients. I'm tired of failing the work that we do, that we get paid for. I'm tired of failing the businesses that we work for. We're software developers, but we continue to fail. And we fail because there's stories, I hear stories like these a lot. I do a lot of consulting with and advising clients. And I hear where this guy told me that he hired a consulting company and they told him it would take 9 weeks to do something. And he didn't really hear from him for about 6 weeks. And then on week 8, they finally contacted him and said, "Oh, we're going to be late." And he's sitting there, he doesn't know. He doesn't know why or how. All he knows is that suddenly he's told that they're late. Or a friend of mine, she had this wonderful idea for a website. She had this wonderful idea for her business. And hired a consulting company. And they worked for a year, used up all of her money. And she didn't end up with what she wanted. She didn't end up with something that actually satisfied what her business needs are. So this is kind of what I want to talk about. This is me, back with long hair, not the dinosaur. So I'm Corey Haines. I got here Tuesday. I appreciate we did a code retreat yesterday, code retreat today, and now this talk. So appreciate everybody coming out and squishing into place. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about, and then we're going to somehow figure out how to have a little hands-on exercise that is a fun time. So it's more than just what a lot of times we do. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the fact that we know how to build software effectively. You know, we've been doing this for a while. We say that our industry is young, but for the most part, we know how to do it. We have technical practices that we talk about, but in the end, we waste our time. We waste a lot of time arguing over technical practices. And it's fun to argue. It's fun to go out, have a bunch of beers, and sit there and argue with each other about whether or not certain practices work, or whether they're hard, or whether they're worth learning. But we miss what the main point is. The main point is this thing about business value. And when you're having a discussion, it's always fun to drop this word, business value, because anybody can use it, and it's sort of that trump card. You get to say, oh, it's all about business value, and nobody can tell you you're wrong. Because it's like, oh, well, no, it's not about business value. And then everyone laughs at you. So, but the problem is that business value is a very murky term. It's a term that it's harder to define what we mean when we talk about business value. And so, instead of it, I like to flip it on its head. And instead, when we talk about software development, what we really want to talk about is the value that we provide to the business. Talk about what their needs are and how we can come in and help them. And it's really about this. There's all this talk about agile and software craftsmanship and these really fun words that nobody is going to argue with you about. But there's really one core thing that gives us value and gives value to the businesses that we work at. It's about shrinking the time it takes between two important things. And those things are, how long does it take before you do something before you find out whether or not it's the right thing to do. And everything that we talk about can boil down to this. Because when you come in and you talk to a business or your customer or the people that are paying you, and you talk to them about building code, writing it new features, what they need is they need to be able to shrink that time. They need to tell you, I want something. And you need to be able to say, well, I can tell you whether that was the right thing to do very rapidly. Or even so, doing something, the time between doing something and figuring out what the next thing to do is. That's also something that we have to shrink the time between these two. And it all comes down to this concept of feedback loops. Everything that we do should be focused on taking the feedback that our systems and our techniques and our practices that they give, the feedback. We want to make that very small. We want to make the loop very small. And it's not just at the high-level feature. It's not just at the very small-level code. But it's at all levels. We want to talk about how long before that line of code is justified. We want to talk about shrinking the feedback loop between building a feature and if that's justified. And so I'm going to talk about implementation tonight. I'm not going to talk as much about looking at feature level. And when they say, I need the user to be able to log into my website, or I need to be able to, search effectively on pictures. But I'm going to talk more tonight about the really small level, the detail of the minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour work that we do. And all of it comes back to, if you want to provide a lot of value to the business, we know that the business, over time, they're changing. The market changes. They always have people asking for new things. And so it comes down to this. The reason we want to change and shrink the feedback cycle is because we want to minimize the cost that a company faces when they need to change something. So when you put a new feature out into production and it comes back and the business or your client says, oh, I need to change that. Now that I see it, I realize it's not exactly what I wanted. I'm sure most of you have never had anybody come to you after you developed the feature and go, that wasn't really what I wanted. You're like, why didn't you tell me that? Why didn't you tell me that? And it's difficult. It's difficult to think in the abstract. It's difficult for people to go and write down what it is they want. But once you've developed it and you've put it up there, it's much easier for them to go, that's not exactly what I meant. And what we want to do is we want to minimize how much it costs for them to change their minds. Because that's what happens. We really want to, this is a chart that a lot of people have seen, that, oh, well, over time, the time to add a feature, the cost to add a feature increases. But the promise that we're supposed to be giving, the promise that Agile gives, and the promise that a lot of the talk of software craftsmanship gives, is it's trying to get to this. It's trying to get to this graph, where over time, naturally, as the system gets more complex, over time, it does take longer and longer to add new features. But we don't want it to go exponentially like this. We really want it to do this. We want it to even out so that a year in, it's still fairly easy to change things, to change your system. One thing that comes up is that, the difference between Yagni, which is you ain't gonna need it. It's a common term. We're very happy to throw this term around, Yagni. It's sort of one of those things that if you call out Yagni, nobody is going to go, oh, you're wrong. It's another one of those fun buzzwords that we get to use, and it just stops conversation. And so I want to differentiate between the idea of Yagni, which is really about features. It's about saying, I need my system to do X, and you say, are you sure it needs to do X right now? Can we get by oftentimes you hear the concept of minimum viable product when people are building stuff. And that's really important because that's where you stand there and go, do you need this feature for people to pay you? Do you need this feature for your system to be useful? But in order to do that effectively, and in order to build a system that does not cost more, or that you don't have to put in all of these extra features, you have to provide your business the ability to change very rapidly. You have to provide them the ability to go, I would like something new. And you say, that doesn't cost much at all. And it really boils down to this, minimizing the cost. We really need to get down there. And one of the ways that we do that, and one of the ways that we talk about that, this is a big concept in extreme programming, is this idea of emergent design, or evolutionary design. And a brief kind of explanation of how it looks is this probably is how most of your systems look. Beautiful. Beautiful grid. At least when you write your first feature, it looks like this. Usually the very first thing you build really nice software. But then, of course, the business comes and they ask you to add a feature. So you tack on a feature like that. It's nice. It's got a nice circle in it. Then they come and you add a new feature. They want you to change a feature. And then, of course, time passes. And then what ends up happening, you get this, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing if you're in a museum looking at this on a wall. It's a beautiful abstract drawing. But it's not beautiful when you go and have to work with it. I don't know how many of you have ever worked with a system like this. I know I've worked with a system like this. And every time I do, I ask myself why I wrote that. Because, man, those are no fun. Because then they come and they say, let me add a feature, and you just sit there and your mind goes, how am I supposed to work with this? I don't know. But what evolutionary design and the whole concept of it, at its simple heart, the heart of evolutionary design, is all about the one thing that we often forget. And that's where you add a feature. It's the same feature, same mess that we made, adding it, getting it out there. But the one step that's very important is you clean it. You want to come in, you want to use the techniques that we all know how to do. But we rush because, we have to get to the next feature. But if you stop and you clean it up, you're back at a nice design. It's more complex. There's now 6 squares instead of 4. But it's still a nice structure. So when you come and you add a new feature, you clean it up, it is more complex, but it's still back to being nice. You go and you change a feature, clean it up, continue. Time passes, and what ends up happening is you end up with a nice, clean design, a nice, cleaner design. And we know this works. At the very beginning of a project, when you're very rigorous about cleaning, when you make sure that you write things, you name things well, you create appropriate abstractions, this is what we have early on. But if you clean at the end, or in between, then you end up with this. And the beauty of it is that you look at it, it goes like this. So you, all along the process, you sit there with a nice, clean system, a clean architecture that you can work with. And, another name that we talk about is this iterative development, where you're releasing a lot of things. And so your client comes and they say, always, that they want this. They want you to have a system that they can easily work with. But when you deliver, and the client sees it, you know that they're going to come in, and they're going to say, I need circles. I really do. I thought I needed squares, but I really need circles. Anybody had that happen?
Just today.
Just today?
How's school now?
Yeah, it's happened. And that's because the best way for a client to work, to actually figure out what they want, is to see it. So you want to give it to them like that. The key is to deliver early. Give it to them as soon as possible. Give it to them when it's still this nice, clean, small architecture. So then the client can come in and say, I need circles. And it's an easier change. This is really the heart of it all, is giving it to them early, giving them the features that you want very early. Keep going. Then you end up delivering what they need. It's much nicer to change a system when it's small than when it gets very large. It allows them to look and say, you did something for me. It took you a week, or it took you a day. And they can then say that's not exactly what they want. And it works on dropping that feedback cycle, on making the time between doing something and figuring out if it was the right thing to do. It drops down the time between doing something, they get to see it, and then they can tell you what the next thing to do is. Which always begs the question of how often should you deliver? How often should you give it to your client? Should you give it to them weekly? Should you give it to them after every iteration? Should you give it to them at the end of 6 months, 3 months? But of course, in order to really work effectively, you want to give it to them as quickly as possible. Even before you have functionality working, you want to give it to them weekly, you want to give it to them daily, every feature that's done. If possible, there's a lot of talk now about continuous delivery, where as soon as you have all of your tests passing, it just automatically gets put into production. Here's a picture of my cat. Okay? So it really boils down to that dropping the feedback cycle. Want to see my cat again? Pretty cute? Okay. So another wonderful way that we do this between doing something and figuring out if it was the right thing at an even smaller level is testing. How many people test their code? Well, hopefully everybody tests of some nature. You don't just write code and stick it up there. You got to test it somehow. But again, it's really that question of when you do something, when you add some code, how do you know that it was the right code to add? We've all, well, as I'm finding, not everybody has lived in that world where the testing cycle took a month and actually had to wait for your QA department to spend through the QA cycle, and you spent a week working on a feature and they tell you that it'll be 2 weeks before we can release it. And that's really difficult to do. It's difficult to shrink that feedback cycle. It's difficult to give and get feedback from our customer when it takes 2 weeks to just release it and show it. And so it's all about verification at all levels. It's about looking and seeing all of the different circles and all of the different cycles of figuring out whether what you did works, whether it was the right thing to do, whether it was the right feature, really pushing it down. We know how to do that. We want to always be able to tell people that it works like it did yesterday, at that time frame. I once worked on a product that we worked for a year and a half on it. And every day, my primary customers took the code from my build server and used it in production. So every day, every morning, they had an automated task that copied the code from production or from a build server, and they used it to do their job. And my promise to them was not that all of the features were done, but my promise was that it worked like it did yesterday. If my test passed and it made it through the build server and the build system, then I knew that it at least worked like it did yesterday. But a day is really long. We really want is to be able to say that it works like it did 5 minutes ago. The last big project that I worked on, that was, it was biggish, it was small, we only worked on it for about a year and a half. But at the end of a year and a half, my release cycle took about 10 minutes. So no matter what we did, it took us about 10 minutes to run all of our tests and actually elevate it to production. And that's not because I'm a great developer, but it was because we had put in those things in place, and everywhere that there was a bottleneck, we looked at it and saw what could we automate, what could we do that would shrink that cycle down. And it came up, thinking about it, I realized that as I was doing a lot of this, this is what I needed. I needed a testing system that had these three properties. They were fast, they're focused, and they were full. They're fast because computers are faster than people. Anytime you have a person or a monkey clicking around through your website to see whether it works, you can have a computer do that. Anything that can be scripted should be scripted. Anything that you can speed up, you should script, you should automate. Which always brings in that question of how fast should your system work? You know, is a day enough? Should your entire release cycle take an hour? Should it take a week? Should it take 5 minutes? And I have one rule for myself whenever I'm writing a whole system, is that my test suite should be faster. No matter how fast it is, you should look to see if you can make it faster. And really, faster. You should always try to get it a little bit faster. If it's 30 seconds faster, if you do that 100 times, then you're 100 times 30 seconds faster. I'm not a great, I have a math degree, but I didn't learn how to multiply. 50 minutes. Look at that. That's amazing. You save 50 minutes of sitting there clicking around. And you want it to be focused. It's easy, and we've all run into that case where you make a small change to your code and 100 tests break, 100 automated tests break, and you have to go maintain them and fix all of your tests. And that's discouraging. It's demoralizing. And it makes you wonder, why am I even writing these tests? They cost more. But the key is to look and say that's not how it should be. Tests should be focused. If you make a small change, 1 test should break. 2 tests should break. Something that makes it so it doesn't really cost anything. And every time you have a situation where you make a change and a bunch of tests break, you should stop and realize that there's something wrong with your test suite. You should take the time to figure out, how do I focus those tests in? Do I have tests that are testing the wrong thing? Do I have more tests that are testing the same thing, so I can get rid of one of them? And a good way to test that, we often ask, who tests the tests? How do you know that your tests are okay? And the one trick that I like to use is make a small change and see what breaks. As you're constantly working, go in and take a number. If there's a constant in there, change the constant. See how many tests break. It should be a very small number. And if it isn't, take the time to look and figure out what's wrong. You know it'll pay off in the end. The other is that it should be full. Go in and make small changes and make sure a test break. You want to make sure that you can trust your test suite. You want to trust that automation. Because if you want to be in the situation where you can click a button and go up to production, you want to be sure that you're confident in your tests. And of course, what you want to do is you want to use some of the best practices that we know for writing a good test suite. You want to do test-first programming. Write your tests first. If every time, every line of code that you wrote was there to make a test pass, then you have a pretty good confidence that every piece of your code is tested by something. So use test first, test driven, talk about full stack tests, look and see what are the appropriate levels to work on. And of course, automated tests. They always help you go faster. And since you have to test your system, you're not going to take it... Don't leave. Somebody doesn't like testing. So you've got to test your code. It's a bothersome process. Nobody likes doing the testing. Nobody likes doing manual testing. So look and see, what are the parts that make this a long process? What are the parts of your development that make it long to figure out whether what you just did was the right thing to do? Another technique that we know and love is parallel feature development. When you have a team, you have several people working on it. It's important to have that system where you can rapidly tell. Don't wait to find out whether you broke somebody else's code. Always ask yourself, am I breaking somebody's stuff? How can I find out if I'm breaking their stuff? That's another feedback cycle. You want to look to see, can you bring that down? Man, people are dropping like flies. You want to use continuous integration to run through. I don't mean to make everybody stare. Sorry. You want to look through and say, with a good continuous integration process, it minimizes the time between doing something and finding out if you broke somebody else's stuff. Another nice thing about continuous integration is that if you integrate often, if you check in your code often, there's usually that rule that the last person who checks in has to do the merge. So that's one of the reasons that I like to check in all the time. As soon as my test turned green, I check in, because somebody else is going to have to merge that code in, because that's never that fun. And of course, there's all sorts of other practices, but we don't need to go into them. You've heard about them. But when you look at practices, look and see, how does this minimize that feedback cycle? And you want to say, are there other ones? It's really about when somebody, like I stand up here and say, you should do automated tests, or you should do continuous integration, or you should do pair programming. Always ask yourself, or ask them, how does that minimize the feedback loop? How does that shrink the time between doing something and knowing if it was the right thing to do? Because all of these techniques, they should provide this value. And when we talk about it, when we talk about these techniques, we shouldn't be arguing over whether or not TDD is okay. Because it's a done conversation. TDD shrinks the feedback cycle. So it's not really the techniques that should be discussed. It's really the values that should be discussed. It should be brought up to that level. You should be able to have the discussion on the value that these techniques give, not on the techniques themselves. Different people have different styles of these techniques. So rather than saying, I do BDD, and I do outside in, and I do this and that, and I use mocks, and somebody goes, mocks suck. And then the other person goes, no, they don't. And then the other person goes, yes, they do. And then you go, no, they don't. And then you go have a beer, because then it's okay. But it should be about that. What value do these things give me in finding out whether or not what I just did was the right thing to do? And really, when it boils down, this is the conversation that should be had. You don't have to do your development like I do. You don't have to use all of the techniques that I do. But if you don't, if I do something, or somebody else that you work with does a technique that shrinks this feedback cycle, you don't get to just say, no, I'm not going to do it. What you need to do is you need to be able to replace it. You need to be able to say, I don't do that, but I can get the same value from that by doing this other thing. And with that as the conversation, it stops being a little fight, a purse fight. It's really about standing up and talking about what are the values that we get. And it really says the techniques are something that are valuable. My techniques are valuable because they give this value. Your techniques are valuable if they give the same value. If they give more value, and more, they shrink the feedback cycle even more, then I don't have a place to stand and say mine's better. Because it all boils down to that. So, that's my little spiel. Thanks. Awesome.